The stretch is the most controversial topic in the fitness industry.
Little Milo, the only two words I fucking know are lengthened partials, wolf.
Full range of motion matters most. Compared to partial reps, full ROM is superior across the board.
Today, I want to talk about stretch-mediated hypertrophy and why it's dumb.
Based on the research I conducted, I have been a huge advocate for lengthened training. However, I've received a lot of criticism and backlash about my opinions and research on lengthened training. So, in this video, I'll respond to all of those. You'll get a response straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. This is going to be the resource to training in the stretch and lengthened partials. I'll be giving my recommendations on how to incorporate the stretch for maximum muscle growth at the end of the video too. But why is the fitness industry so interested in the stretch to begin with? My own interest in the stretch arose during my PhD. The topic of my PhD was the effect of range of motion on muscle growth. Full disclosure, when I first started my PhD, I fully expected full range of motion to be best for building muscle. However, it turned out I was wrong. In 2021, we conducted a meta-analysis on all the existing studies that manipulated range of motion during different exercises and measured muscle growth. On the whole, full range of motion seemed marginally better than partial range of motion when we simply dichotomized between the two. However, we took a novel approach. Instead of assuming all partial reps were created equal, we thought of the muscle lengths involved. When we compared partial range of motion at short muscle lengths to a full range of motion for hypertrophy, full range of motion did seem superior. However, when comparing partial range of motion at long muscle lengths to a full range of motion, partials actually seemed to be superior. At first, I was shook. This sent me down a deep rabbit hole. I read up on all the research I could find comparing shorter to longer muscle length training. Lo and behold, the finding that longer muscle length training builds more muscle than shorter muscle length training, all else being equal, was a very consistent finding. Whether it was longer muscle length isometrics versus shorter muscle length isometrics, partials at longer muscle lengths versus partials at shorter muscle lengths, lengthened partials versus a full range of motion, or shortened partials versus a full range of motion. Longer muscle length training just seemed to consistently cause more growth, or in a small number of cases, at worst, the same growth. That's exactly what I outlined in the discussion for our meta-analysis, which was eventually published in 2023. I started appearing on podcasts to communicate the research to practitioners. After all, the best research is worthless if it isn't being used in some regard. But before I do, let me tell you about how I've been having my creatine. I've been having these creatine gummies by Tasty Gains. I take 3 a day to get my 3 grams of creatine in. I've had a variety of people try them, and both in terms of taste and texture, they're pretty solid. So, if you struggle to get your creatine in, I'll leave a link in the description so you can try them out. One of the first podcasts I appeared on was a roundtable with Dr. Mike Israetel, Dr. Pack, and Steve Hall. I spoke about the research. Dr. Mike Israetel, a fierce proponent of full range of motion at the time, brought up 3 critiques of lengthened partials. These are still mentioned today, so make sure you pay attention. First, regional hypertrophy. Your muscles are made up of hundreds of thousands of individual muscle fibers. Mike hypothesized that different muscle fibers were more active and therefore stimulated during certain parts of the range of motion. A full range of motion, therefore, would do a better job of stimulating more muscle fibers. In contrast, lengthened partials would fail to stimulate as many muscle fibers. This would result in regional hypertrophy, a phenomenon where only certain regions of a muscle grow effectively. While regional hypertrophy is well documented to happen in exercise science, it doesn't particularly seem to occur with lengthened training. Research suggests that while focusing on the stretch might preferentially grow more distal areas of a muscle more, farther from the origin point of a muscle, it doesn't grow proximal areas less than using a full range of motion. If lengthened partials did fail to recruit certain muscle fibers, this would show up in measurements of muscle growth in these studies. But it doesn't. Whether it's a proximal or distal areas of muscle, the research consistently finds similar or greater muscle growth when focusing on the stretch. Therefore, lengthened training seems to recruit just as many muscle fibers as a full range of motion does. Second, the ability to track performance. One of the primary ways we can assess whether we are progressing, and therefore whether our current training, nutrition, and recovery protocols are working, is by our numbers in the gym. Are you able to lift more this training block than last? Are you stronger today than a year ago? If so, there's a good chance you built some muscle. Bigger muscles aren't the only thing that can make you stronger, but in the long run, they are the main thing making you stronger. One of those variables is range of motion. Although there are exceptions, less range of motion lets you lift more weight, and vice versa. With a full range of motion, you usually get pretty well-defined start and end points to a range of motion. This lets you remove one variable from the equation, making it easier to track progress. In contrast, partials can be a bit harder to standardize. As a result, tracking progress can become a bit harder. However, it's important to remember that your body adapts to stimulus, not range of motion. Even if your range of motion were to fluctuate 10 or 20% week to week, this likely wouldn't have a big impact on hypertrophy. Plus, it's not as though partials are that hard to standardize. The start point of each rep is always a full stretch. It's the end point we need to standardize. For machines, there's usually some sort of landmark you can aim for. For rows and Romanian deadlifts, just going past the knee is enough to standardize the motion. For curls, tricep extensions, compound pushing, pulling, and even squatting, just aiming for a 90-degree angle at the top of the rep is probably sufficient. Having coached people with lengthened partials, and having used them myself for around 3 years now, standardization is more a theoretical issue than it ever is a practical one. Full stretch as a start point and identify an end point to reach for. The final critique Mike brought up is that focusing on the stretch could result in certain muscle groups taking over. I've also seen influencers like Jeffrey Very Schofield bring up this potential limitation. For example, since locking out the bench press is thought to be mostly triceps, doing lengthened partials on the bench could mean less tricep stimulus. First, let's break down exercises into being either compound or isolation exercises. For isolation exercises, it's impossible not to work the target muscle. If you're doing a curl, you're training the elbow flexors, the biceps brachii, the brachioradialis, and the brachialis. No other muscles can flex the elbow, whether you're doing a partial or a full range of motion. For compound exercises, there could be some merit to the idea, but the truth is, we just don't know whether there is yet. For one, most compound movements involve the target muscles pretty equally throughout the range of motion. In the lengthened half of the bench press, you are flexing and horizontally adducting the shoulder while extending the elbows. The triceps are absolutely involved at the bottom part of the movement. No other major muscles can extend the elbow. Simultaneously, your front delts and your pecs are flexing and horizontally adducting the shoulder. Unless you move like a robot, performing each joint function sequentially, all muscles are involved at all points of the range of motion. Of course, it's possible that the challenge the triceps face is larger at the top of the rep than the bottom. That said, in most compound movements, the disparity in challenge during different parts of the range of motion for a given muscle is minimal. Combine this with the fact that you're likely doing 3 to 8 different exercises for every major muscle in your body, with different resistance profiles, joint angles, with some being isolation exercises and others being compound exercises, and it becomes unlikely that minor disparities in the involvement of a muscle in the stretch position compared to the shortened position is an issue. Let's move on to a controversial topic, neuromechanical matching. Neuromechanical matching is a proposed principle in which the nervous system determines which muscles to recruit for human movement based on their mechanical advantage in performing that task. Let's say Bob and Joe are construction workers. Bob loves to work on Tuesdays and will work Tuesdays at a discount. Joe, on the other hand, hates working on Tuesdays and will charge you double. So, if you need a job done on Tuesday, you should probably just hire Bob. The same idea goes with neuromechanical matching. If multiple muscles can accomplish a joint function, your body will recruit the one that can do it the most efficiently. In the lifting space, the principle of neuromechanical matching is used to claim that muscles grow best when trained where they have the best mechanical leverage. Think of a curl. You have 3 elbow flexor muscles that can flex the elbow. Let's say the biceps have the best leverage between 0 to 70 degrees of elbow flexion. Neuromechanical matching would hold that your nervous system will preferentially recruit your biceps throughout this range of motion. The biceps will contribute the most to force production, the biceps will be trained most effectively, and therefore will grow more than the other elbow flexors from being trained through this range of motion. That's the idea of neuromechanical matching. While influencers will have you think it's a well-established principle, they're actually lying. The principle of neuromechanical matching was first coined in 2019 in a review paper by Hudson and colleagues. They proposed the principle as an alternative to Henneman's size principle for explaining how muscle fibers are recruited by the nervous system. Specifically, the evidence they based the principle upon was predominantly in inspiratory muscles. There was also evidence of neuromechanical matching in the calves when walking. However, contrary to what some influencers may claim, the principle has not been widely adopted when it comes to lifting weights. Nearly none of the citations the paper has received since it was written has been about lifting. In fact, nearly all of the citations it's received has been from papers about breathing and gait, aka walking. Notably, breathing and walking are very submaximal tasks. Lifting close to failure is not. When you're pushing close to failure, your body probably doesn't have the luxury of picking and choosing what it wants to recruit anymore. Let's go back to Bob and Joe. This time, you have the big job in mind that would take 2 man days to complete. Although Joe doesn't want to walk on Tuesday, Bob alone won't be able to get it done. So you need to recruit both, even if one workout will be less efficient than the other. It's an all hands on deck situation, not a cost cutting situation. For now, the principle of neuromechanical matching appears relevant only in the cases of breathing and walking until we actually had research in lifting suggesting it matters. In the context of lifting, however, it's far too early to say whether it even matters. People claim that you should be training a muscle where it has the best leverage so that it is recruited, activated, and grows best are making wild leaps of faith. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence casting doubt on neuromechanical matching for hypertrophy. Let's use the glutes as an example. It's commonly said that the glutes are strongest near full hip extension, which is part of the reason people advocate for hip thrusts. You focus on the range of motion, where the glutes have a mechanical advantage. So, does training the glutes at shorter muscle lengths, where the principle of neuromechanical matching would predict more growth, actually cause more growth? A study by Kubo and colleagues compared half squats, where the glutes have more leverage for hip extension, to full squats, where the glutes have worse leverage for hip extension. The glutes barely grew when trained through their strongest range of motion. In contrast, when squatting deeper and reaching a better stretch, participants saw robust glute, adder, and quadricep growth. But ultimately, when it comes to hypertrophy training, the burden of proof currently lies with the advocates of the principle of neuromechanical matching. The evidence to support the principle simply doesn't exist yet. That's not to say it couldn't be true, but there's certainly evidence to the contrary and next to no evidence in support of it. Until that evidence exists, I don't think you should worry about neuromechanical matching. And certainly, neuromechanical matching shouldn't be prioritized at the expense of focusing on the stretch. The same camp of influencers will say that lengthened training is only beneficial in untrained lifters. They'll claim that lengthened training will only be beneficial for a couple of months. This claim is predicated on the research on stretch-mediated hypertrophy. In a series of studies from the late 1900s, researchers exposed animals to intense stretching protocols. These protocols frequently involved weeks and weeks of nearly non-stop stretching at high intensities. Following these protocols, researchers often observed insane muscle growth. Not only that, the animals' muscle fibers themselves would increase in length. Specifically, the researchers observed longitudinal growth, the addition of sarcomeres in series. In animals, this longitudinal growth typically occurs rapidly for a couple of months before slowing down substantially. It's because you can only add so many sarcomeres in series. Otherwise, eventually, your muscle fibers would get longer and longer to infinity. So longitudinal growth can only occur for so long, and that's where the claim that lengthened training only benefits beginners comes in. Since stretch-mediated hypertrophy includes the word stretch, these influencers falsely equate adaptations from lifting in the stretch and the adaptations that we observe in this research from the 1900s. To be exact, they expect that emphasizing the stretch at the gym will grow more muscle by adding sarcomeres in series, just like it did in animals. To verify this, my colleagues and I performed a systematic review trying to determine whether there was evidence to support this contention. We looked for all studies that measure a proxy for longitudinal growth, fascicle length, from shorter versus longer muscle length training. Our results? We found that lengthened training did lead to more overall muscle growth. There was mixed evidence of both a bit more longitudinal growth and radial growth. Importantly, you'll notice I mentioned proxies of longitudinal growth. That's because no study to date has actually looked at the addition of sarcomeres in series from lengthened versus shortened training. Likewise, there's evidence of proxies for longitudinal muscle growth increasing even in athletes and lifters who've been training for years. Finally, it's unreasonable to expect similar adaptations from stretching at high intensities for hours on end, for weeks on end, to spending an extra minute or two per week in the lengthened position. After all, that's effectively what it amounts to when you're doing lengthened partials. To be able to confidently say whether the stretch only works in beginners, we would need more studies in trained lifters. To date, we only have a few, that's one of the true limitations of this research. While there's no compelling reason to expect experienced lifters to respond differently, actually studying advanced lifters and measuring muscle growth is the best way to arrive at the answer. The same goes for studying different muscles. We have research in the biceps, triceps, quads, hamstrings, glutes, and calves showing that lower muscle length training leads to more growth. To be extremely confident, we would need research in muscles like the pecs, the side delts, the back, and even more. But again, there's not really a reason to expect different muscles to respond differently. Another take I've heard on LinkedIn training is that it only works if it allows you to lift more weight. Some studies have found this to be true. In a study by Pedrosa and colleagues, for example, doing bottom half leg extensions, which will let you lift way more, led to more growth than doing full range of motion leg extensions. In general, I also think that movements which are most challenging in the shortened position will benefit most from doing some lengthened partials. You're cutting out a non-productive bottleneck to performance, allowing you to put more effort into the most productive part of the range of motion. However, there are also studies finding that even where lengthened partials cause you to lift less, they're still beneficial. This is the case in a study by Pedrosa and colleagues, where they compared top half partials to bottom half partials in the preacher curl, and found more growth from the bottom half partials. Just look at the picture they provide. Participants really went from hoisting the 100-pound dumbbells to pencil making the tens. The same is true of a full range of motion when you compare it to a shortened partial. In the study by Kubo and colleagues I mentioned earlier, squatting deeper beat out half squatting by quite a bit, in spite of being able to lift way more when you're half squatting. Sometimes people even bring up passive insufficiency as a concern for training in the stretch. Passive insufficiency occurs when muscle fibers are lengthened to the point of reducing actin and myosin filament overlap, making it hard for your muscles to produce any force. While not a scientifically rigorous test, a good practical test for whether you're at risk of exposing yourself to passive insufficiency is when going a little bit deeper means you need to reduce your loads drastically. In my personal experience and coaching experience, this has never really happened. Instead, for most exercises, going say 20% deeper might only cut loads down by 5 to 10%. While passive insufficiency is a real thing, I don't think it is a reasonable concern for lengthened training. So I wouldn't use can you lift more that way as a heuristic for whether or not an exercise should be done with a full range of motion or with lengthened partials. Likewise, because people often don't like the idea of doing just lengthened partials, they'll just implement them after failure. Do a set with a full range of motion. After you can't get another full rep, extend the set using lengthened partials. I call these lengthened supersets. While this is better than just using a full range of motion, you get a couple of extra reps in the stretch position after all, I didn't think this was as good as doing lengthened partials. That's because you're only doing an extra 2 to 5 reps, typically, in the stretch. Compare this to doing just stretch partials, where you're getting the whole set in the stretch. You move the needle way more with just lengthened partials. Fortunately, MyoAdapt makes it super easy to track progress. You can view the history for any exercise as well as what your all-time PR is. Using smart progression logic, MyoAdapt makes sure you're lifting heavier over time and getting stronger. MyoAdapt is a coach in your pocket, the smartest training app coming to the market very soon. To be notified when MyoAdapt launches and to receive a free trial and lifetime discount if you sign up, head to myoadapt.com and sign up with your email. No spam, but you will get to use the best coaching app out there. We recently wrapped up a study comparing the muscle growth from lengthened partials to lengthened supersets. And well, all I'll say for now, until the study is out, is that I was probably right. Lengthened partials are probably the way to go. But what about fatigue? Doesn't training in the stretch cause more muscle damage? I think this might be the critique I hear mentioned the least, but is the most valid based on research. There are a few studies in the elbow flexors that suggest as much, and one more recently in the quadriceps. However, I think that comes with a few caveats, which is why I'm not too worried about it. First, few people even have the time to train enough in the gym to truly struggle with recovery. For somewhere around 80 to 90% of people, in my coaching experience, time to train is the bottleneck, not recovery. This is backed up by the research. Instances of overreaching, never mind too overtraining, are remarkably rare. Second, fatigue research typically isn't ideal in terms of ecological validity. This is true of the current research, which is nearly exclusively isometric in nature. Likewise, while training to failure or lengthened training can be more fatiguing initially, that doesn't mean it will be a long-term issue. After all, the repeated bout effect means that your body does get used to damaging training. Third, most forms of training that grow more muscle also tend to cause more muscle damage and or fatigue. This is true of training closer to failure, training with higher volumes, and potentially training at lower muscle lengths too. It is normal to be fatigued during hypertrophy training. If you're trying your best to avoid fatigue in the gym at all costs, you will forego the training that will grow the most muscle, and that likely includes lengthened training. One of the strangest critiques of lengthened training has been to accuse Jeff Nippard, Mike Israetel, or even me of bias. I'm not sure where this comes from. First and foremost, my job is to report the findings of the scientific literature. Whenever I mention a study, I make sure the study is linked in the description, so you can read up and see whether my claims align with the findings and the actual study. Second, I'm not really profiteering off the stretch. In fact, I had designs of selling a template called the Stretch Program if more research came out in support of the stretch. But since recent research has been a bit less compelling, I haven't gone ahead with that. Let me close out this video by giving you a summary and my best recommendations on lengthened training. We have 24 studies or so comparing training in a more contracted position to training in a more stretched position. Across the board, we almost always see similar, or most of the time, more muscle growth when emphasizing the stretch. That's not to say there aren't still questions we need to answer. We only have around 5 studies comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion. This is a limitation, though I'm personally not too worried about it. After all, we have around 2 studies broadly examining the concept of the stretch. These studies have provided strong evidence of a principle whereby more stretch generally causes more muscle growth, the same way more volume usually does, and training closer to failure usually does. The biggest limitation, in my opinion, is exploring more stretch-focused exercises. Most studies to date compare somewhat shortened training to somewhat lengthened training. As a result, we don't fully know what happens when you pursue very long muscle lengths intentionally. It's possible that you don't need to maximize stretch, but merely emphasize it to a reasonable level. Here are my recommendations. For maximum muscle growth, I think you want to pick exercises that focus on the stretch. They should expose the target muscle to a near maximal stretch. The exercise should also be harder in the stretch and relatively easier in the shortened position. I have a whole list of videos that speak about this at length. Manipulating tempo to spend more time in the stretch is also a good idea. A 2-second eccentric, slow the eccentric more as you reach into the stretch, pause briefly, and explode out of the stretch. Avoid pausing in the shortened position. Full range of motion is a good approach. Ensuring you reach a full stretch in the exercise you're using will give you better muscle growth than just horse cocking the weights. Likewise, based on the broad principle of more stretch equals more growth, and the few studies we do have comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion, I do think that if you want to maximize muscle growth, you should incorporate lengthened partials into your training. I've been doing exclusively lengthened partials myself in my training for size for the past 2 years. I aim for somewhere between half reps and 1/3 reps when using partials, as that is what's been used most in the research. As I discussed earlier, I would prioritize doing the whole set as lengthened partials over just finishing off a set with a few partials when you hit failure. Based on our upcoming study's results, and the fact that lengthened partials allow you to spend more time in the stretch, I think they're the better choice. As for how much of your training should or needs to be stretch focused, or needs to be lengthened partials, to maximize muscle growth, I can't say. I personally find the literature quite compelling, which is why I've been doing nearly all my training exclusively as lengthened partials. Based on the research, it's at worst giving me the same growth, but there's a chance it will give me a slight edge in hypertrophy. I've delivered to you the research, some of the limitations of stretch training, rebuttals to many of the critiques, and recommendations on how to incorporate stretch training. How much of your own training you decide to switch to lengthened partials is your own decision. Likewise, it's your own decision, but for your clothing and the gym needs, I urge you to consider Rascal Apparel, the most comfortable, stylish, squat-proof gym clothing I've ever owned. RascalApparel.com, use code WOLF at checkout for 10% off. This shit was basically a podcast. Lengthened partials, where gains are always a stretch, but never partial. Until next time.